so much. My name is Richard Gage, AIA. I've been a practicing architect for 20 years, and I'm a member of the American Institute of Architects. I became interested in the World Trade Center high-rise collapses on 9/11 after hearing the startling conclusions of a reluctant 9/11 researcher, David Ray Griffin, on San Francisco Bay Area's KPFA radio, Guns and Butter, with Bonnie Faulkner in March of 2006. This has changed my life radically and launched my own personal and professional quest for 9/11 truth, inspiring me to found Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, which now numbers hundreds of architects and engineers who are demanding a real investigation into the destruction of these buildings. Like many other architects, I've designed numerous fireproof steel frame buildings in my career, including these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the day-to-day construction administration services for this $120 million high school in San Ramon, California. I'd like to start by thanking each and every one of you for being willing to consider the very difficult subject of the destruction of the World Trade Center and its staggering loss of life on 9/11. Just as architecture and engineering projects are sometimes joyful, sometimes quite difficult, this particular project has proven to be extremely difficult. Not difficult in terms of reaching conclusions, but difficult in terms of the implications of those conclusions and finding people who are open-minded enough to be willing to hear the facts about these building collapses. Check out every fact that we point out, because it's extremely important that we know the whole truth about this event. After all, it served as the pretext for the invasion of two countries in which already over 1 million people have perished. Also as the pretext for the loss of many of our own cherished liberties here at home in the United States through recent legislation such as the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, and the forthcoming Senate Bill 1959, the Violent Radicalization and Homegrown Terrorism Act, in which many of us can be named a terrorist and have no right to an attorney or trial by jury. Another 9/11 could happen again if we don't dedicate ourselves to finding out exactly what happened and why, and to bringing those actually responsible to justice. We must peer into the painful part of our recent history and to re-examine the relatively new physical evidence from 9/11 which we have not seen in the mainstream media, and to find out why, for instance, a 2006 poll by the New York Times and CBS reveals that 28% of Americans believe that the Bush administration is lying, and not just about Iraq, but about the events of 9/11. And Time magazine reporting that 36% of Americans consider it likely or somewhat likely that government officials either allowed the attacks to be carried out or carried them out themselves. Of even greater concern, another poll that year by Scripps Howard, Ohio University, which found that a shocking 16% of Americans believe that the World Trade Center Twin Towers were brought down by explosives. NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, claims they found no evidence for explosive demolition at the Twin Towers. Later, they admit that they never looked for it. How can you find what you are not looking for? Well, architects, engineers, scientists, and many others looked for it, and it was not hard to find. We've been speaking about it for 2 years now in over 36 cities, in a dozen states, and in Canada. We're proud to be a part of the international 9/11 Truth movement, which is growing by millions every year. We now have hundreds of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth demanding a real investigation. This is our website. You can find on the right side the bullet points of information that we're going to be going through today. It's ae911truth.org. On the left side, you'll see the PowerPoint. You can step through it at your own pace because you may not have time to follow and read all the text and absorb the information that we're rapidly going to be going through. You can also watch the DVD on the left side, and you can purchase the DVD, of course, online. You can sign the petition after you find yourself convinced. The ever-growing number of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth are not conspiracy theorists. we're building and technical professionals looking at the science-based forensic evidence in the destruction of these high-rises on 9/11. First, let the technical truths emerge. Then, if necessary, cope with the inevitable conspiracy and other questions. Tonight, we're presenting to you the technical truths, the evidence found for the explosive demolition of all three World Trade Center high-rise collapses on 9/11, the iconic Twin Towers and the mysterious Building 7. 9/11. Just the utterance of it brings us right back to the terror-filled morning. We were subjected to these shocking attacks, killing thousands of Americans, destroying cultural icons. The 6 years has given us time to step back and examine these events more objectively, to step back from the shock-induced trance, really, to evaluate the relatively new evidence that's only come out in the last couple of years, and to re-examine these three high-rise collapses more objectively. Let's begin with an overview of the events of that morning in order to start us off on the same page, looking at the jets and the impacts and how this myth developed.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience.
So when it was attacked again, he immediately...
Elements of the myth. The impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust.
We ran through the building, it went into the...
Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
Well, let's take a look at that. What we do is we apply the scientific method, which many of us learned in 7th and 8th grade. It's the best way yet discovered for winnowing truth from lies and delusion. The simple version looks something like this. We formulate a question. How did the Twin Towers collapse? We perform research. We make observations. We construct a hypothesis. We have an idea how it collapsed. It collapsed by fire. It collapsed by explosive controlled demolition. We make some predictions, and we test those predictions and those assumptions with experiments, objective, verifiable, repeatable experiments. We analyze the results, and we draw conclusions. Now, if those conclusions are found to be corroborated by the evidence, we report it in an open, transparent manner, where our experiments and our findings can be repeated. If it is not found to be corroborated, we think and try again and construct a new hypothesis with new observations, new research. Buildings are destroyed by a number of different forces, each of which have very different and identifiable characteristics. For instance, fires affect buildings quite differently than controlled demolitions. Fires, by their nature, tend to creep from place to place. As they run out of fuel, moving to fresh new fuel sources, leaving the burned out area to cool. So when collapses do occur, and by the way, you'll note that they've never occurred in over 100 examples of very hot, very large, and very long-lasting fires. Buildings tend to fall over. They fall asymmetrically. They're burned out on one side organically, if you will. It's a natural process. They don't fall straight down through the path of greatest resistance. Let's listen to Jonathan Barnett from FEMA talk about what fires are expected to do in steel buildings.
The way in which steel-framed buildings behave in fires depends on their construction. In this test, done by British Steel in 1995, a large amount of typical office furniture was burned to see what would happen to the heavy steel beams that supported the ceiling.
When steel is bare, when it heats up, it gets weaker. It's not that it melts in a fire. In fact, normal fires are not hot enough to melt steel. Even if you were, for example, to use an unusual fuel like kerosene, you cannot achieve temperatures hot enough to melt steel. But what happens is it starts to lose its strength. And as it loses its strength, it starts to sag. It becomes softer and sags and can no longer support the load.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
So what was the cause of the devastating, explosive failure that happened to the World Trade Center?
These particular buildings collapsed. They follow the path of least resistance, or they fell over. You can see that the building structure holds the building together in some recognizable form. The structural elements have not been dismembered from each other, and their concrete is not pulverized to dust. They follow the path of least resistance, which is generally over. These buildings exploded. Witnesses hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. There's thick, billowing, and enormous pyroclastic clouds of pulverized concrete. The expansion of the gases very quickly produces this cauliflower-like formation that we see in the smoke. This is a controlled demolition. Let's focus on this type of destruction first. We have hundreds of examples from all across the country from which to make our comparison because it's the most commonly used method to demolish high-rises. This is what a high-rise looks like when it's being demolished with explosives. Controlled demolitions can be engineered in many different ways. Normally, the purpose of a controlled demolition is to remove a structure while avoiding damage to adjacent structures, and to do so economically. Typically, a tall building like this is demolished by placing thousands of cutter charges throughout the columns and beams in the building and then detonating them in a very precise order, starting with the interior structures and then progressing outward, synchronistically timed floor by floor. Destroying the interior columns allows the unsupported weight to pull the exterior inward. Destroying the building from the ground up allows the weight of the building to be harnessed to do much of the destruction. So the result is an implosion, producing a vertical, symmetrical collapse at free fall speed into a consolidated rubble pile that's broken up and ready for loading and shipment. Now, this is a feat that only a handful of companies in the United States can accomplish. Let's take a look at some of the key characteristics of controlled demolition. First, we have a sudden onset of destruction at the base of the structure. We have straight down symmetrical collapse into its own footprint because demolition waves remove the column support, resulting in a free fall speed virtually through the path of what was the greatest resistance. Thousands